All right. Lesson 2-8 we're going to talk about today is explaining the multiplication and division related facts property. Okay? If you remember the other day, we did the triangle of addition and subtraction, where here's addition, here's subtraction. So if I had a 2 here and I had a 3 here, obviously the sum of 2 plus 3 is 5. So the difference of 5 minus 3 gave me 2. The difference of 5 minus 2 gives me 3. Okay? So on and so forth. The sum of 3 plus 2 gives me 5. We're going to do the same thing, except we're going to use the multiplication property of equality. That means getting things even on both sides, to help solve of the form a times x is equal to b, where we are solving for x. That means you want x by itself. So, looking at these related facts triangle, as you notice here, 6 times 5 gives me 30, so the product 6 times 5 gives me 30. Okay, 30 divided by 6 gives me 5. 30 divided by 5 gives me 6. Okay, 5 times 6 gives me 30. So they use letters here. Okay, C times H equals P. H times C equals P. P divided by C equals H. P divided by H equals C. Okay, looks exactly like your triangles that we had the other day. The only difference is now we're using multiplication and division, where they used addition and subtraction before. Once again, you could use fractions and you could also use decimals. So a negative 0.3 times 5 is a negative 1.5. 5 times a negative 0.3, positive times a negative still gives you negative. Remember all that stuff. A negative 1.5 divided by 5 gives you a negative 0.3. A negative 1.5 divided by a negative 0.3 gives you 5. Same thing over here. 1/2 times 18 is 9. Okay, 18 over 1 times 1/2 is 18 over 2, which gives you 9. Okay, 18 times 1/2 gives you 9. 9 divided by a half gives you 18. Why? Because when you divide by a fraction, you must flip and multiply, which brings you to 9 times 2, which gives you 18. 9 divided by 18 gives you a half. 9 goes into both these numbers once and twice. So here's the multiplication property of equality. It says, for all real numbers a, b, and c, if a equals b, then you can multiply c to both sides. Okay? You can multiply c to both sides and have it be the same equation. Okay? Multiplication property of equality. As long as you multiply both sides by the same number, okay, they are still equal. The division property of equality says for all real numbers a, b, and c, and all real non-zero numbers c. C cannot be 0. Why? Because we can't divide by 0. Okay? If you divide by 0, it's undefined. You need to write that down. You cannot divide by 0. If a equals b, that means a and b are equal to each other. And then you divide one side by c, you also have to divide the other side by c. You're going to get me sick. You're going to get sick of hearing me say this, okay? But that's what algebra is all about. Whatever you do to one side, you have to do to the other. If I divide by some number on the left side, I have to divide by some number on the right side. You have to keep both sides equal, okay? So let's look at example 1. It says solve 16x is equal to 192. Well, we could use our triangle. Okay. If you remember, side by side, 16x. 16x is the same thing as saying 16 times x. Okay. I hope we all remember that. Side by side means multiplication. So, in my triangle, 16 would go here, my x would go here, my 192 would go up top. So, to do this problem, as you can see, to find x, I have to take 192 and divide it by 16. And that's going to equal my x. Well, 192 divided by 16 equals 12. And you can check that answer. Well, how could you check that answer? Well, then 12 times 16 has to equal 192. So, 12 times 16, and if you're doing it on your calculator, right? 12 times 16, you got 12 here, 6, there's 72, you got a 0, and then you got 2, 1, and you get 192. Okay? Now, how would you do this the algebra way? And this is the way that we're going to be doing things. Algebra way. I need to get x by itself. So what I'm going to say is the inverse operation of multiplying by 16, because I want x to stay here, the inverse of multiplying by 16 is dividing by 16. Whatever I do to the left side, I have to do to the right side. This is my little river on the equal sign. So 16 divided by 16 gives me x, which is what I want. That's my unknown. 192 divided by 16, we all know, is 12. Okay? Moving along. Multiplication property of 0. For any real number a times 0 is equal to 0 times a, which is always 0. All this is saying is anything times 0 is itself. Okay? This is a big note down here. You're going to want to write this down. You have also learned that you cannot divide by 0. Another way of putting it is that a fraction cannot have 0 in its denominator. This can be explained by using related facts. I kind of already told you. Okay? If you divide by 0, it is undefined. It can't happen. You can't take 0. Well, you could take 0 or whatever, but you can't take 1, and this is what this says, 1 over 0. You can't take one notebook if nobody has a notebook. Okay, that's what it's saying. If you're trying to steal a notebook from somebody and nobody has a notebook, are you getting a notebook? No. It's never going to happen. So, example 2, you're going to want to write this down and pay attention to it. Okay? A says 0 times x is equal to 0. So this says, what number could I multiply by 0 to give me 0? What number could I multiply by 0 to give me 0? Well, that is all reals. Any number. I could put in 5 for x. If I put 5 in for x, 5 times 0 gives me 0, right? I could put 20 in for x. 20 times 0 is 0. Any number would work. If you look at B, it says 0 times x is equal to 4. You can look at this two ways. What number times 0 is going to give me 4? What number times 0 is going to give me 4? Well, no number is. There is no number I could take times 0 is going to give me 4, because any number times 0 gives me 0. Okay? Or the other way you can look at it is, to get x by itself, I have to divide by 0. And we just stated that you cannot divide by 0. 4 divided by 0, x is undefined. Can't happen. No solution. Okay, very important to know. C, 13x is equal to 0. What number times 13 gives me 0? Or what you could say is the inverse operation times 13 is divide by 13. 0 divided by 13 is 0. Okay? What number times 13 gives me 0? Well, only 0 can. Okay? Very important example to know. You will find this on your quiz or test. The multiplicative identity property. All this is saying is, what can you multiply by something to get out the original thing? So, what can you multiply Mr. Johnson by? What can you multiply Mr. Johnson by to get out Mr. Johnson? Well, if you multiply Mr. Johnson by 0, Mr. Johnson times 0 is 0. That's not what I want. I want Mr. Johnson. I want the identity. Okay, I want out the same thing. Well, Mr. Johnson times 1 gives me Mr. Johnson. Okay, so what this says is A times 1 equals 1 times A, which equals A. Yes, whenever you multiply something by 1, you get out the same thing. The multiplicative inverse property says for any real number A, where A cannot be 0 because it would be undefined, A times 1 over A equals 1 over A times A, which is the same thing as equaling 1. So what this is saying is 2 times 1/2, okay, 1 over A, this is my A, right, equals 1. Well, does that work? Well, yeah. 2 over 1, the 2's divide out, leaves me with 1, 1. 1 times 1 equals 1, and 1 times 1 equals 1. 1 over 1 equals 1. Could do the same thing with fractions. 3/4 times 1 over 3/4. Well, 1 over 3/4 turns into change to multiplication and flip. So what's 1 times 4/3? Well, you're going to say 4/3. Well, my 3's divide out, my 4's divide out, leaves me with 1's all around here, leaves me with 1. Very important to know with fractions as well. Be comfortable with that. Example 3 says, find the reciprocal of each number. Remember, the reciprocal is you just flip it. You flip it. Okay? So, this says 1.5625. Well, you could put this over 1. 1.5625. The reciprocal of 1.5625 is 1 over 1.5625. All you do is take the denominator to the numerator to the denominator, and that's your reciprocal. Fractions are very easy. 4/15, the reciprocal of 4/15 is 15 over 4. C is kind of like A. You put this over 1. A negative 34 over 1. You flip it, becomes a negative 1 over 34. Okay? I always like to put the negative up top. Okay? That's just me. I like to have this negative stay in my numerator. Okay? It's still negative. This is still negative. Okay, if this is negative, your reciprocal is negative as well. Why? Because it has to equal 1. So a negative times a negative gives me a positive 1. Okay, so that's all I have for you today. Please enjoy. We'll be testing shortly. Hope you're studying.